This is kind of a little bit of a new area for me. This is kind of, you'll see this is trying to take the idea of data management a little bit different direction based on some of the experiences that I've had. And I've had a lot of experiences in the last 10 years in working in research and in limnology. I started actually in 2004 doing a survey for Paul Hansen, and I'll just briefly touch on that so you guys get a perspective on where I'm coming from. And then I'll talk about some key concepts that I've noticed are really important in data management that transcend all disciplines, all technologies, and whatnot. It's really just kind of these core ideas that are pretty important. And then I'm going to give you a few of the practical examples that I've kind of gleaned these ideas out of that are largely part of Glee and some of my own work. But yeah, in 2004, I did a lake survey for Paul, and you'll see actually there's a lot of things that go into I'm currently a PhD student with Paul Hansen and Emily Stanley in Madison, Wisconsin, and a lot of what I've done in the past has really fed into what I'm doing now, which I said you probably all feel you're doing. But I did a lake survey where we literally tried to sample at random as many lakes as possible in a certain geographical area, being the Northwoods of Wisconsin. So this was our field equipment. We had a canoe and a vehicle, and we were in the middle of the forest trying to get to these lakes. And some of them were as small where we could simply push the canoe out and then pull it back in. And some were so large that we were facing large waves and had to come back on a different day kind of thing, because all we had was a canoe. So then after my undergrad, after I did that, I stuck around and worked on largely data management initially and Bowie construction. So a lot of the technologies we're talking about today. I got to stick around. The first thing I ever did was called DB Badger, and this slide Paul Hansen actually made to present somewhere else. And I created this, and then he made fun of it by saying data pig. Apparently my artistry is not as good as my programming. So it was a MATLAB program to do data querying out of a big Oracle database was basically what it was, the LTR database in Wisconsin, primarily focused on the Bowie data that we had. So I did a lot of work. This is really where I cut my teeth in terms of programming as well as data access and kind of concepts of data management. Then kind of along comes Glee. It had already been started before that point, but this is when I started to actually get interested in what's going on in Glee. This data management thing was something we were interested in. So comes the next version of DB Badger. DB Badger 2 was an online web app, again focused at data querying, had a really big database backend, focused on streaming data from Buoys. I then went on to try to do a couple of other side projects during this time. I was interested if I could apply this database web app concept to sensor management, so I built Sensor Badger. You can see a pattern in the names. I built data streaming software to try to get data from all these different sites in Glee and bring them into a centralized database called Stardust. This was my next phase, which was David Bowie phase. Actually, the Mendota Bowie that Tim had a picture of before is called David Bowie. This is the 2008-2009 phase. And then most recently, a lot of thinking, we've been thinking bigger, larger, more macro scale, so we started working on a project we called LakeBase to try to bring in all sorts of data, being even more general in the types of data and even broader in kind of the spatial extent. Now, this is my background, but what I'll say is that I have tried, and I have tried again to figure out what kind of technologies ecologists and biologists and ecosystem scientists want and need and find useful. And I have found that many of the things that I have made do not apply. I will simply say that flat out. I have found that the culture of science, the culture of ecosystem science, doesn't necessarily fit well into this framework. It doesn't. A top-down perspective on data management where there's a single central place to store it doesn't seem to work very well. The ecology and the sciences are far more aggregated. They're a network. They are flat structures largely. You know, there's a few exceptions, but on the whole, it's very flat. Lots of individual labs, lots of individual people on their own. So in that theme, today I'm not going to talk about databases and I'm not going to talk about web portals, because I think actually to some extent these kind of things are not what fits most, at least, into ecology as it works today. I'm going to talk about something that seems really, really boring, but the more I've worked with computers, as I said, I started in ecology in 2004. I started by building my first computer in 1995. So my history with computers is even much longer. And I have been continually fascinated by the basics of computing and what is really useful. And we're going to go back to the file. Okay, we're going to go as almost as most basic as it can be in terms of data management. And more importantly than just the file, which I hope can apply to everybody. Who here stores data in files? Okay, I think everybody, almost everybody's got their hand up. Yes, we are all using files. We're all using files to store. Sometimes we have bigger systems, but files are what we store data in. It's often what we use data when in the scientific process of working with the data, doing research. And more importantly, I'm going to truly emphasize the idea of well-formatted files and what that can give you, because really everything is a file. You may just not know it. A database is a file. Websites are largely files. They're just complex files. And there are a lot of different formats. There's a lot of different ways that we can deal with these that can help us do the science that we want to do. And there's a few central tenets. But before I move on, actually best if there's feedback. Any questions thus far? Any burning questions? I haven't gotten any really meat yet, but okay. All right. So the going on to the kind of the few tenets that I've seen that I think are really useful in doing scientific data management for everybody, not just someone who's a data manager. This isn't something that's over there. Someone else does this. We all do this. We all manage data if we're doing any sort of data collection, any sort of analysis. There's a few key things that I think are really useful, and I'm sure there's others, actually, and if people have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. One thing that I found really useful is a common format. Now, I know we can't always have this, but even within your own work, I have found, so a great example is when we've started projects where we've done data collection, the signal processing group in Glee, we collected something like 20 data from 20 different sites. And from those 20 sites, I'm pretty sure we got 25 different file formats. So even within the same group, often people start to diverge in the way they're storing the same data. And something as simple as making sure that bathymetry data is stored like the other bathymetry data that you're using. Streaming data, air temperature, water temperature, data from the Bowie, in common formats. Is it a CSV? Is it a tab separated file? Does it have a header? Does it have the same headers? Things like that can go a long ways. And this is just a diagram of if you have the same types of data in different formats, it can become more difficult. So starting with, that's pretty simple. Another thing, now we're treading into territory that's people might find interesting. I think that a concept of done is really important for data management, because often it's best to think about it can really improve your ability to reduce mental burden, and it will really improve your ability to organize, because once you have a data set that is complete, it can become separate from your working data sets. It becomes separate from the data sets that you're actively collecting. And it's not to say that a data set always has to maintain its complete status, but when we're thinking about it at a file level, if you have a file which is complete and you know is working, is in a good format, if then instead of adding more data to that file, which can end up in corruption, can cause all sorts of potential issues, if you start a new file which is in progress, it can be a very powerful thing. Another concept that relates to that is the idea of a clear master, where you have a data set, and I'm going to bring up examples of this in a second, but the idea where you have a file which contains kind of the golden data. Okay, this is where our data is. If we get new data, it goes to somewhere where there's master data. If we find that there's an error, we make sure to change the master. And these projects and things flow from the master. And one thing that I found that I think we have a tendency a lot of times to do because we're actively working on things is that the workspace in which things become different. This version has been changed in one way, this version has been changed in another way, but there is no single place to go for that data. And I would also argue that this really works for collaboration as well. This really improves the ability to collaborate because it's far easier to find your data set if you have a clear concept of a master data set than if you have this large workspace that you've been actively working in. Again, these are just guidelines that I've seen work. And kind of lastly is a concept of better, where if you make modifications to the data set, if it improves it, if it's added a longer time span, then you might say that that is better, and that is going to become your new master. Okay? If you do something as an experiment and you find that it is an improvement, if you try some error checking and it doesn't happen, then that is tossed. But again, you have this master copy that is only increasing in improvement, or this master set of files which is increasing in improvement. And this really comes from a lot of computer science and like programming techniques, where you have a body of code which is increasing, it's improving through time. Bugs are coming out of it, new features are being added, but it's always increasing and improving. Okay, so any questions thus far? I know this is really abstract. I'll get more concrete here in a second. Yes?
So if you're using files, do you or have you considered using like a version control system so that you can go back to the master if you end up not liking it?
Yeah, and actually, yes. So he asked whether when I'm using files, have I considered using version control. And so version control is something a lot of developers use, programmers use, to maintain their different versions of code. And it's a great way to both make forward progress while keeping your past history. And it allows you, it gives you kind of a fail-safe at all times, where if you start to change something and find that you have gone in the wrong direction, you can always come back. So whether I've thought about using version management, absolutely, and I think for a lot of this, it works very well, in fact, to use version management. Not all version management systems work great for these kind of data, but I think it's something that actually I think the scientific community will pick up on in the next 10 years, probably. Other scientific fields already have, and ecology is just a little behind, I think. And I think it's definitely a great one. Is there another question? Yeah.
Explain how that works exactly?
Version management?
So we're talking about files here. Some of them, like a lot of us are going to be doing this in like Excel or MATLAB or something like that.
How the version management works, is what you're saying? Well, so a version management system works by... there's a variety of technologies they use, but basically, imagine what you can do is you have a directory with a set of files, and you can say, okay, I'm going to start here. Maybe you start with an empty directory and you start putting files into it. But every time, at a certain point, anytime you decide, you can say, okay, this is a version, and it takes a snapshot of that. And then what happens is then when you make addition. Yes, exactly. Some software takes a snapshot and stores that that snapshot, everything it needs to recreate that snapshot somewhere else. And then what happens is you make a change to a file, you can say, I fix the temperature profile data from the Bowie. And you can say, check. And not only can you store the versions, you can store comments to describe the changes that have been made. And then it stores everything it needs to recreate that change. So it may not be the entire snapshot again, it's just the change. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then, yeah.
So like using the signal processing example, right? Mm-hmm. We're working on the manuscript, and you know the lead is at some point saying, okay, we're no longer working on version 1. We're going to store version 1, but now we're working on version 2. Mm-hmm. Manually. right?
Yes, and
It's
this
just
is-
like,
this is-
there's like 10 files in there.
And this is what I tried to
1.1,
accomplish with the
1.3,
signal processing
1.4.
one. Is exactly that, was that we had.
Management?
That is a very, very ham-fisted way of doing version management without using some tool, software that has a ramp-up period and a learning curve. If you were to use that, I mean, version management is not. It's not a trivial piece of software. It's not a trivial tool to use. So it's a very simple way to accomplish version management. Yeah.
It's a little bit like generic software backup systems that have incremental backups. As long as you don't clean out the old ones, and you can go back and find something if you know a date, and you don't have to invent it because those exist. You just have to use them.
Yes, exactly. And
But they don't have the advantage of annotations and explicit decisions about versions either.
yeah, and the other thing that a lot of version management systems these days are designed to do is to work in collaborative teams, because ultimately, probably the first collaborative interdisciplinary workers were programmers working especially when the internet started to take off for them in the late 80s. People really started to work in teams far more as programmers, and every open source project today is a microcosm of a big collaborative team working on a single project, moving it forward.
It's not so obvious how someone working with data can do the same sort of thing without a special tool. It's not a program, but
Yeah, it's not a program, but it's just files. It's just files. It's all just files, I swear.
Here, back to the just files. Can you go back to your workspace slide? So I totally get the master, leave it. If you fix something, so you fix something in the master, how do you keep track of, okay, I fixed it in the master, now I've got to fix it in project 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10?
Well, the thing this depends then on how you set up those projects. There's a lot of different strategies, and I'm no expert. I don't know if other people have other ideas. I didn't exactly mean to make this. You got an idea, or do you want to?
I do have an idea, but go ahead.
Well, I'll just say that the thing that I have tried to do is, if I have a master and I fix it in these projects, I mean, those projects all just work off a copy of the master, and so if I change this, it's as simple as copying that over and replacing the subsidiary version that I'm using. And I am very much in a programming world, so I program processes, and so I just have to rerun something, and it's now used the new data. And I think that this is something that, no offense to the older people in the crowd, but I feel that a lot of the grad students, most grad students I know now work in an R or some environment, well, really just R primarily in this field, environment. And Excel is still great for quick visualization and data formatting, but a lot of bigger analyses are done in R. And so this makes sense in that environment. If it's an Excel environment, it's a little harder.
You have to remember which files, yeah, and that's the environment.
Yeah. Another advantage of using a programming environment like that. So, yeah. You want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, another advantage of version control system is you can have separate branches. So like your lab might have a master, and then I, as a grad student, might essentially is copy that master, and now I have a branch which we'll call one of those projects, and I can do stuff, and then if it's in a good position, my advisor might want to merge it back into the lab's whole thing, and he can do that, and the version control allows for that, so that I can have my own branch, and if it's good, it can get merged back into master. If it totally sucks, it can just go away.
Yeah, these are excellent concepts that have been developed in the developer world that I think have relevance to the scientific world far more than we think they do. Or it's just going to be difficult to embrace these new tools like this, because the branching of things is something that's been around in programming for 15 years, probably. I mean, yeah. Anyway, all right. I'm just going to move forward just a little bit, and then we'll probably have lots of fodder for new questions. So some of the examples, and I just want to emphasize that I think that these may also seem really straightforward. When I put them down in this presentation, one of the things I was thinking was, wow, I don't know, is this going to bore everybody to tears? because it's like, yeah, duh, you should have, you know, a place where you store your data. But I've seen, you know, if you keep these in your mind as you work on projects, I think they don't always perfectly apply, but they can help avoid common pitfalls with dealing with data sets, especially with larger groups and larger data sets. Because here's a great example. A concept of a clear master isn't a big deal when it's just your computer and you're doing these things and you know all of these steps that you've done in the project. But when someone else is dealing with this as well and you're trying to collaborate with 5 other people, if I know where the master is, then I can develop something that leverages off the data in that file. If I'm looking at a folder that looks like this, I have no idea what's going on. It's more communication time with me to figure out who did this, where the state of it is, which file I should be using. But again, this clear master, and I say this because I have fallen into these issues. We just recently had a project, I could probably show you this file, or this folder, where there were files, and there were 15 of what theoretically was the same information. And there was underscore Gretchen, underscore Luke, underscore version from Wisconsin, and it became absolutely unmanageable. So clear master would have helped this process. So some of the examples I'm going to use is the Metabolism working group that Tim talked about. Lake Analyzer as well, which is something that Tim also mentioned, which it has brought in some of these concepts. And then a side project that I've been working on I call Bathyabase. And then another one that I'm somewhat involved in, which is the Wisconsin Lake Modeling Aggregation, or WILMA. I'll just call it WILMA. And the Glee Lake Metabolism working group had a whole bunch of data from a whole bunch of lakes in Glee. And the key things were like dissolved oxygen, wind, water temperature, a lot of time series data. And again, they had 25 different lakes, and they got all sorts of different formats. So the goal that they had to come up with was, well, we need a common format for all these 25 lakes because we're going to be applying the same model to all of them. And we need to do this in a way that everybody can kind of play along as well, and that'll come up here in a bit. So this is something why I also argue, you'll see later, that I'm not going to argue that everybody uses a database or an Oracle server, because a lot of us are good at dealing with files, but not all of it, but a far smaller subset of us are good at dealing with complex databases and interrelational things and NoSQL databases and things like that. For really practical science, I think this is a really good way to go. So the formats were everything you might imagine, and you can't exactly see this probably super well, but here's just an example where we have year, month, number, and then day number, day of year, which you've probably seen, and then sample time, which is in another number, okay, all over the place. This then has different depths. This only has time. There's no different depths. All sorts of different formats to deal with. So what they came up with, I actually thought was pretty elegant, was a very simple data structure. It was a very simple organization scheme where each lake got a folder, and that folder was the name of the lake. It was fairly straightforward. Worked really well for about 25. Would probably work with scale pretty well for even a few more lakes. Within each of those directories, they had the master data set, which was stored in a text file format. For the text file format, they made it a tab delimited format, and they followed a standardized naming scheme for these files. Again, all just files, but worked very well, where dissolved oxygen ended in underscore DO, par ended in underscore par, sensor temp, and so on. And if you'll notice, another thing that they did is they split up the different parameters. And this is something that I found very useful, and I'd thought about adding a 5th item, which was reduce interdependency in data sets, where if you can have things which are more independent, it often makes working with them and improving them much easier. But anyway, and then they also had notes, which allowed them to document the process they went through, because they weren't saving multiple versions of these files, which was each change. They simply made sure that they had a recorded history of what they'd done to these files. So within this file, as I said, is a tab delimited. And another brilliant move, you'll see, I'm sure many of you have probably ran into this, is that they picked a common date-time format, which was really different from what everybody else had used up to that point, but actually happens to be an international standard, if you're interested in those kind of things, which was simply year, month, day, hour, minute, second. Year, month, day is separated by dashes. Hour, minute, second is separated by colons. There's nothing else. I mean, it sounds like the stupidest thing, but that alone was one of the biggest issues they had to deal with as well, because they had European data, which would had month, day, year. They had data from North America, which had day, month, year. They had data from somewhere else, which had year, day, number, time. And these things, come up time and time again. And so actually, I've been on a one-man mission to make year, month, day, hour, minute, second, if you want it, as the de facto standard for all date time formats in our field. I don't know if it'll happen.
Can you give an estimate of how long it took Chris to fix all of that? I'm sure it was a lot longer than some people might expect.
Tim, how long did it take Chris to get and fix all the data? I would say months. I mean, in the data, I know that for the signal processing, let's just say I had all the data in hand. I remember formatting a lot of the data. And a lot of the data actually came from this group, which was a godsend because it was in good format. But the data that I had to format, I probably spent cumulative of 40-hour week on it easily. And it was only another one parameter in 5 or 10 lakes. So.
Spend a bunch of time on it too, so that's...
Yeah, that's right. I really shouldn't. Sorry, I was not just me. It was
not
like
just
a lot
40
of
hours. It's,
yeah.
I don't know how much.
And it was communication with those end users. And my favorite from that signal processing one was a data set that I got, which had been in a European format, but then had been opened on Excel in the US, which then converted all the dates which made sense in the US, but were in the European format, into the American format, but then left all the rest as the European format. So any days under the number 12 had gotten switched, and then all the days that were numbered above 12 were still in the original format. It was a nightmare.
Been there, I appreciate all that. I just wonder how much additional uncertainty there was because of time zones. What you show there says daytime, it doesn't say UTC.
That's an excellent question. Yes. And this doesn't include time zones. They chose not to do that is because of the way the modeling worked, and they just wanted local time because although we're very rarely explicit about it, we usually are using local time as a proxy for the position of the sun. So to say break this between sunrise and sunset, they often use an estimate of what the local time should be at sunrise and sunset. So this does not include time zone. I'm picking my battles.
You could have said solar time if you wanted to be explicit, because it really varies a lot.
It does, I know. And I have no great answer for that. I agree. But it would be even harder to include, This is something that's actually relatively straightforward, even in Excel to do, but to add a time zone gets a whole, we know the time zones for these, so that helps as well.
It's not in your database.
But it's not in the database. No.
My preference is to add UTC to that, so there's no ambiguity, and then if you need to know solar time, then you have to have a location.
Oh, yeah. That's true. That's not a bad idea. Yeah. Yeah, the UTC thing is tough. Any other questions? So this is what they came up with for this one, which I thought was relatively cool. As stupid as it sounds, again, it was a pretty good way to deal with a large set of data. And this, I'll also add, and Tim was mentioning this as well, that this data then took off because this was a nice, large, cohesive data set of a similar type from a bunch of different systems. This has now been used in how many different projects, Tim? Dozen? Yeah, this has been, if not experimented with even more times, because it's just such a nice data set to work with. It's all clear, it's all handled well, which I think we can all get to. Just takes these simple ideas. Yeah. Another example then, I'd say the next iteration in this was actually Lake Analyzer. And Jordan Reed, when he took this on, wanted to come up with a simple file format that would allow you to feed data into Lake Analyzer. He had to have some sort of file format that he could expect to get that Lake Analyzer would consume. We'll have a demo tomorrow, so you guys can all learn more about that. But he took the concept that Chris Solomon and their group had done and just kind of went one step further with it, which worked out surprisingly well as well. And again, same input. I'm off of my schedule. So he took and dealt with this, and I'll show you what he came up with at the end here, actually. But we've already talked about this. Here's his final output. This is what he came up with. Not only did he standardize, he used the standard date and time, which goes a long ways. And we found that it's not, that we can get a long way without worrying about adding the seconds as well. If you want to have a date, you can omit the hour and minute as well. Most things can handle the parsing of this date, whether it has the time or not. But still, a lot of systems work natively with this. Excel will open this. Any Excel from any continent has no problem with this. So I'd recommend it. R works very well with this. MATLAB works very well with this. It works very well in a lot of things. And then he standardized the columns as well and tried to standardize some of the naming. And one of the things he did, instead of adding it in the name, he created actually a slightly different set of suffixes to the files. So WTR is water temperature, WND is wind speed, and .bth is bathymetry, for example. And these are all tab-separated files in this format with a column header. This secondary number here is the offset of the water temperature. So this is the depth that all the temperature sensors are at, and those are in meters. And if you feed data in and it's in this format, it will work, which is an amazing thing, in my opinion, for a model and a piece of software to do. One of the key lessons that we learned also from working with the Lake Analyzer stuff, I have to say, is know what a text file is, because text files are often not what you seem. This is the one brief piece of history, I'll say, in my talk. This is a talk that I rather enjoy giving, because a text file is not what you think it is necessarily. Text files go, what makes up a text file today goes back all the way to the original Morse code in some ways. Okay? Because there's been this progression, step by step. We didn't start out one day and say, we're going to create a standard for storing text. What they did is they always were integrating the past work, the past standard that was out there. Morse code created the original code for telegraph. One of the issues with Morse code, though, is it took a human operator to both send it and receive it. So later on, there were people who were thinking, what if we want to automate this? Can we make a machine that we can just press a button and it sends the information off? So Baudot, which his name is now eternalized, not so much in the Baudot code, but in baud, as in baud rate, if anybody remembers baud rates from old modems. So he's now eternalized in that for coming up with one of the first ways in which you could use a mechanized instrument to send text data through wires. Donald Murray came up with then even further advancement that allowed for things like periods and things that Baudot did not originally occur. And Murray is actually the one that then made teletype, which you could get. And it was actually rather interesting, and this will come up later. Teletype originally just had a long strip. So the text would just come out, and every character would be after another, and there would be a space, and there would be more characters. And then they started to try, they made a machine that could print it out on a sheet. But they had no way to tell the machine that it should go to the next line. So then they had to create what they called a line control character. And we'll see, this comes up in a bit. And that allows you to say, okay, machine, go to the next line of paper. I've always thought that he looks a little like Jim Kitchell, for those who know Jim Kitchell. And then in 1963, 50 years ago, actually, not too long ago, just a couple months ago, 50 years ago, they created ASCII. A bunch of people came together. This is when computers were starting, really big, monstrous computers were just kind of starting to come out. And they decided that if we didn't agree on something now, we would have 1 billion different standards out there. So we had to agree on something. They did. And this standard still contained the carriage return and line feed, which allows the machine that's printing to return the carriage to the front of the printer and to feed a new line of paper. And as ridiculous as it may seem, those things are still with us today. So I'll show you something. Does anybody notice a difference between these two files? Any differences? Space on top? Is it? No, I don't think so. I think it's the same. No. So these two files are actually fairly different. I was once working. I'll show you. So you can see the difference if we highlight the symbols which are hidden by normal text editors. It's a little hard to see. No, you can see it actually pretty well here. This file, which is typical of Mac OS and Unix systems, only has a line feed character to indicate that there's a new line. On Windows, they still use both the carriage return and line feed. So what often also happens is if you open a file like this in a simple program like Notepad on Windows, all of the lines show up on the same line. It doesn't show it up on different lines. Very common issue. But these legacy issues are still with us today. And the other difference I point out too is that I made these 4 spaces and I made these tabs, which if you don't know what they look like, you're not looking closely, they look like the same thing. I had a graduate student who was trying to run a model. And they had this input file and they were editing these things one at a time. I said, oh my God, I can still use this final file, but then when I put my data in, it doesn't work. It doesn't work, it doesn't work. I'm like, I don't know. It looks fine to me, here, send it to me. And I opened it up in a text editor, and I looked like this, and it should be a tab-delimited file, and they had replaced all the tabs with spaces, and the program expected tabs. So it's amazing what can be hidden in these things, and it's amazing how the sins of our fathers are still with us today, as the technological history sticks around, and we need to remember that. So we learned that knowing text files was really important in that project as well. And if I had any other answer to you, it'd be to get a good text file editor. So common format, tab delimiter, ISO date time, and a standardized header, and you guys will get to play with that more tomorrow. Not quite last, but not quite least. How much time do I have? Oh, okay, I got lots of time. Is Bathybass, and this is just a pet project that I picked up on the weekend. I was tired of not having bathymetry data for my lakes, and I realized that I couldn't find any common file format to store bathymetry data. There seemed to be nothing really agreed upon. And I really wanted something that was in a science-ready format, something that I could really use to quickly pull the information that I needed out of it. And I wanted it to be geo-referenced. So there's actually a lot of great formats in the ArcGIS realm. So this is which was coming in. This was actually like digitized original hand-drawn maps of bathymetry, where they take and they digitize the lines, and then they put them onto a map, and they geo-reference them so that it's in the right place in the world. Each of these lines has some information. For some reason, for the depth of each line, they called them contour int. I don't know where that name came from, but I can tell you I found about 1 billion different variations on depth meters, depth in feet, depth in inches. I'm trying to think what else. Anyway, I've tried to standardize this, thinking about files, simple file formats. So I decided to use a GeoTIFF. Quick idea of a GeoTIFF is that it's a rasterized format. It takes the world, it splits it up into grid cells. Each grid cell can have one or potentially many values associated with it. Here's an example. If you were to say this was a raster of this lake that showed the percentage of lake cover in each cell, and that might be a raster file you might use. And so in doing this, I came up with something that I think is fairly elegant. You can't see this very well, but I've included an example in some materials that I'll hand out as well. It's just a rasterized bathymetry then, where each cell turns into a depth for the lake, and the depth is in meters, and it has the projection so you know what spatial coordinates they are, and you're done. And there's no more ambiguity. There's far less ambiguity in the bathymetry data. It's very useful. And it's bathybase.org if anybody is interested. And I'm happy to have contributions if anybody has bathymetry data. Lastly, I think this is a really cool ending project just to talk about. This is something that Jordan Reed, myself, Gretchen Hansen, and Gretchen Hansen, those three of us primarily, are working on in Wisconsin, where we are trying to model all the managed lakes in Wisconsin. So managed lakes end up being something that has at any point had fish stocking or fish surveys on it. So this is to feed into a larger project. And so we said, well, can we use what is one of the better known processes in lakes, which is the accumulation of energy through the sun and its dispersal through the water column into a temperature profile. Can we model this in a bunch of lakes using driver data? So there's a bunch of different potential driver data out there. And we're trying to do that as accurately as possible for all 2,500 of these lakes. So I would deem this in some ways a macro system project. And the data that we needed have been phenomenally curated, I would say. And it's a testament to the people who have done GIS work. And I'll talk a little bit about those data sets. But a lot of it comes down to reasonable file formats, well curated, and put on websites where they're accessible. There's nothing more than that. They didn't create, there's not big data portals. This is not a query system. This is simply data for, say, the US. So local climate is one that there's been a number of people which they've done projects where they try to, as best as possible, create models to backcast local climate across all of, say, North America or the world. And these can be used to drive these kind of models where we want to say, okay, what was the 30-year history of water temperature in a lake if we make assumptions that the lake has been there for 30 years and the bathymetry hasn't changed significantly and things like that. So the North American Regional Reanalysis is one of those where they have phenomenal data sets, well curated, often in GeoTIFF or other standardized formats available for use. We're also using the USGS National Hydrography data set, well curated, available online, files, shapefile formats, 56 gigabytes worth of shapefiles which define all of the lakes, rivers, and streams in the US is relative. But, and we're also using some satellite water clarity that we got from a group in Wisconsin. And that was one where it's also a fairly standardized file format, but that one's not as important. But so, and lastly, we used canopy height, which was through a project, GeoTIFF, well-organized file format, put up on a website, no portal, no database, just well-curated. Land cover, USGS is the same thing. So we have really, 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 really benefited. Without pretty much all of these things individually, we probably would not have been able to do this project. But because of this curation and this tendency in especially other fields, climatology and things like that, and in some of the agencies to release these data, we were able to do this. Yeah, so anyway, we're taking these right now and modeling water temperature in these lakes in Wisconsin for the last 30 years to see if that predicts changes in fish prevalence in these lakes over time. Good. And I'll just say that as ridiculous as this sounds, if you have a really good file format and if you have a set of files that has been well organized, if you want to share that data, it's as easy as putting it on a website. It doesn't require complex systems. It doesn't require a lot of work. I think there are some ways to do data publications, and I think that this is something that the field, I think personally this is the direction the field needs to go, which is if you have high quality data projects, if projects have been done on them, it's as simple as putting it on a website. No custom programming needed, nothing like that.